Hey guys, tonight we're pulling back the perfectly pressed curtains on one of the most quietly scandalous decades in American history, the 1950s, the era of pearls, pot roasts and picket fences, the era where everything looked wonderful on the outside and inside behind the avocado green refrigerator and the Formica countertops, and the husband who came home at 6 and expected dinner on the table by 6:05, things were considerably more complicated. Now, before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a huge, heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. You know who you are. I love that you're out there thinking about 1950s housewives at whatever wild hour you sent that message. Your suggestions genuinely shape this channel, and I mean that. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always somehow 2 a.m, somewhere, and I find that deeply comforting. Oh, and the channel is now live on Spotify. The link is in the description if you prefer to let history lull you to sleep through headphones. Highly recommended. Now, dim those lights. Put a fan on if you've got one, pull that blanket up to your chin, and make yourself as horizontal as possible, because tonight we are going fully undercover. But first, a few questions worth sitting with. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to run a household like it was a full-time military operation, unpaid, unrecognised, and expected to be done with lipstick on? Did these women actually enjoy making jello moulds with suspended vegetables in them? Or were they doing it ironically and no one noticed? What happened when the husband fell asleep at 9 and the wife was still wide awake with a glass of sherry and a secret? Did they talk to each other? Really talk? What were they reading when nobody was looking? What were they dreaming about while they vacuumed the same carpet for the 3rd time that week? And perhaps most importantly, what exactly was happening at those Tuesday afternoon neighbourhood get-togethers that somehow always ran 3 hours longer than planned? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1953. You're wearing a housecoat. There's a casserole in the oven, a child somewhere doing something suspicious, and your neighbour Donna is already ringing the doorbell 45 minutes early. Good luck. Before the husband stirred and before the children crashed downstairs like a small herd of confused livestock, she was already up. The alarm didn't go off so much as she simply woke, the way women who carry too many things in their heads tend to do, efficiently, quietly, without complaint. The kitchen had to be warm, the coffee had to be hot, and her hair had to be done by the time anyone else appeared. Because in 1950s America, a wife who greeted her husband looking anything less than composed was a quiet failure, and quiet failures had a way of becoming loud ones. So you rise. It's somewhere between 5:30 and 6, depending on how many children you have and how ambitious your breakfast ambitions are. The house is cold in that particular way, that houses get cold when they've been sitting quietly all night without anyone in them to generate heat or noise. You pull on your housecoat, not to wear all day, which would be slovenly, but as a transitional garment, a uniform for the liminal hour before the real performance begins. You descend to the kitchen alone. The coffee percolator goes on first, always first. This is not optional, it is load-bearing. The sound of it, that steady, burbling percussion, is the opening note of the day, a sound that signals to no one in particular that things are under control. You stand at the counter for a moment, listening to it, and it is possibly the only quiet moment you will have until 10 o'clock tonight. Now, the breakfast. And here is where the 1950s morning routine diverges dramatically from anything resembling modern efficiency. There is no grabbing a protein bar. There is no standing over the sink eating cereal from the box like a raccoon with a job. There is a hot breakfast. Eggs, probably. Toast, certainly. Perhaps oatmeal if the children are being particularly virtuous in your imagination. You cook it from scratch, every morning, without visible resentment. The eggs have to be right. Runny yolks for the husband if that's what he prefers, And if you've forgotten that detail after 8 years of marriage, you will hear about it in the particular silent way men communicate disappointment, which is somehow louder than actual speaking. The toast cannot be burnt, the coffee cannot be weak, the orange juice, if you're squeezing it yourself, and some women were, because the frozen concentrate felt like cheating, has to be ready before the glass is needed. Meanwhile, you've also been mentally running the day's schedule, the grocery list, the children's lunches, the thing you promised the church committee, the phone call you need to make before noon, the pile of laundry that's going to judge you from the basement all morning. You're doing this while flipping eggs and listening for the sound of small feet on the stairs, which you will hear approximately 45 seconds before you're ready. The children arrive in stages, some chipper, some catastrophic. One needs help finding a shoe. One refuses the oatmeal on grounds that will not survive logical scrutiny. Someone has forgotten that today is picture day and needs a hair intervention immediately. You handle all of it. You do not raise your voice, or if you do it efficiently and without lingering guilt, because there is simply no time for lingering guilt before 8 a.m. The husband comes down last. He sits. You pour his coffee. He reads the paper. You make a plate appear in front of him with the quiet magic of someone who has been up for an hour already. He may say thank you. He may not. By 7:30 the house is emptying, children to school, husband to the car, both disappearing into a world that exists in 3 dimensions. You stand in the kitchen surrounded by the wreckage of a breakfast that took 45 minutes to make and will take another 20 to clean up. You take one sip of your own coffee, which is now lukewarm, and you begin. There was no such thing as a bare-faced day in the 1950s, not if you were a respectable married woman who valued her reputation and her husband's professional standing, which, according to every women's magazine on the rack, were deeply intertwined. The morning beauty routine was not optional. It was armour, foundation, powder, lipstick, in a shade bold enough to signal cheerfulness, but not so bold as to suggest opinions. It took 45 minutes minimum, and it was expected to look completely effortless. The domestic equivalent of a magic trick performed daily before breakfast. You sit at the vanity. It is a piece of furniture designed for exactly this purpose, a small dedicated altar to the daily work of presenting yourself acceptably to the world, which in practical terms means to your neighbourhood, your husband, and whoever you might encounter at the grocery store on a Tuesday. The mirror is well lit, and it is not flattering, and that is the point. The foundation goes on first, blended with fingers or a damp sponge into something that approximates your skin but smoother, more unified, as if your face were a wall that someone had just given a fresh coat of paint. The standard of 1950s foundation was not the dewy, let your skin breathe philosophy of later decades. It was coverage. Full, decisive, unapologetic coverage. The goal was a face that looked finished, in the way that a room looks finished when all the furniture has been placed correctly and nothing is visibly broken. Then the powder, pressed, firmly with a puff until everything stops shining. Shine, in the morning beauty lexicon of the post-war era, was the enemy. A shiny face suggested exertion, which suggested imperfect management of your physical presentation, which, if you followed the logic all the way down, suggested some broader failure of character. Best to powder aggressively and eliminate the possibility entirely. The eyebrows got penciled in, arched to communicate pleasant alertness. The mascara went on in careful strokes, the 1950s wand being considerably less sophisticated than what came later. It was a small cake of product you worked with a wet brush, and it required patience, a steady hand, and an acceptance that one eye was always going to be slightly more impressive than the other. You developed a favourite eye. Everyone did. Nobody talked about it. Lipstick was the final and most important act. The shade was deliberate. Red for evenings, coral or rose for daytime, a colour that said I am a woman, who's made an effort, which translated culturally as I am a woman who takes her responsibilities seriously. You applied it without the mirror eventually, the way a pianist plays a scale, automatically, accurately, out of pure repetition. Now, the hair. This had usually been set in rollers the night before, which is its own remarkable story involving sleeping on hard plastic and waking up with a headache. But the results, a structured, controlled wave that held its shape for days, were considered worth it. You combed it out, teased it gently at the crown, pinned what needed pinning, and sprayed the whole architecture into permanent commitment with a lacquer so powerful it could survive moderate weather. You look at yourself in the mirror when it's done. You look correct. You look like the woman you're supposed to be, which is not quite the same as looking like yourself. But in 1953, those two things are close enough that you don't examine the distinction too carefully. You go downstairs, you make breakfast. Nobody mentions the 45 minutes it took to be this casually put together. That's how you know it worked. By modern estimates, the average 1950s housewife works somewhere between 55 and 60 hours a week maintaining the home. Nobody was keeping track of this, least of all the people being cooked for, cleaned after and organised on behalf of. The house was expected to be spotless at all times, as if no one actually lived in it, an impressive feat considering someone very much did, along with 2 to 4 children and a rotating cast of visiting in-laws who always arrived with opinions. You have a schedule. You have to have a schedule, because without one the work expands to fill every available minute in the day, which it will do anyway, but with a schedule you at least have the illusion of managing it. Monday is laundry. This is non-negotiable. The laundry pile by Monday morning in a household of 4 or 5 people is a monument. It has weight and ambition, and it will not be reasoned with. You sort it. Whites from colours, heavily soiled from lightly, the children's things from the grown-up things, the husband's work shirts from everything else, because work shirts require ironing, and ironing is its own separate confrontation. The washing machine is new. You are in theory grateful for it. It replaced a washboard arrangement that involved considerably more physical effort and slightly more moral clarity about what the job actually cost. The washing machine makes the washing easier. It does not make the folding, the sorting, the hanging, or the ironing easier, and those are where the hours live. Tuesday is for deeper cleaning, the kind of cleaning that isn't visible unless you don't do it. Baseboards, the inside of the oven, the top of the refrigerator, which collects grease in quantities that seem physically implausible given how high up it is. Windows get washed, floors get scrubbed rather than just swept, and the bathroom, which 3 or 4 people are using with the casual destructive confidence of people who are not the ones cleaning it, gets the full treatment. Wednesday might theoretically be lighter. It isn't. The cooking runs parallel to everything else. You don't cook dinner at dinner time. You begin thinking about dinner at breakfast, start prep at 3, and by 5 you're managing multiple things on a stove that requires your full attention. Nothing is instant. Nothing comes from a bag that already has the seasoning in it. There is a meat, probably, a roast, or chops, or a chicken, and vegetables prepared from their original vegetable state, and a starch of some kind, and a dessert if it's a day that calls for one, which most days do. Nobody asks how long it took. Nobody thinks to ask, really, not because they're unkind, but because the invisible nature of the labour is structural. The house is clean, the food is there, the children are fed and reasonably presentable. The machine is running. That it requires a skilled operator working continuously is simply not part of the operating theory of the 1950s household. What the women of the era developed, in response to this, was an extraordinary efficiency, a capacity to run multiple threads simultaneously, to anticipate needs before they were expressed, to troubleshoot problems with whatever was on hand. They were managing logistics operations of genuine complexity without job titles, support staff, or overtime pay. The house, at 5:30 in the evening, looks exactly as it's supposed to. Dinner is ready. The surfaces are clear. The children have been redirected from whatever they were doing into something presentable. You've worked a full day. You'll work another 3 or 4 hours after dinner. You would never describe any of this as work. That wasn't the word for it. The weekly trip to the grocery store was never just a grocery run. It was a performance, a social audit, and occasionally a competitive sport. You showed up put together because running into a neighbour in curlers was the sort of thing that got mentioned at Bridge Club for months, and you navigated the aisles with the quiet precision of someone who had memorised her husband's preferences, her children's allergies, the current prices per pound, and the unspoken hierarchy of who got to go first at the deli counter. You have a list. You always have a list, written in the specific shorthand of someone who's been doing this long enough that the usual is a meaningful entry. The list is organised by aisle, because you have done this route enough times that your mental map of the store is as detailed as a floor plan. You know which checkout lane moves fastest. You know which produce arrives fresh on which days. You know that if you want the good cut of chuck roast, you have to get there by 10 in the morning, and you cannot hesitate. The car, if you have it today and you may not, depending on what the husband needed, is parked carefully. You check your hair in the rearview mirror before you get out. This is not vanity. This is reconnaissance. Because the grocery store in a 1950s suburb is a social space first and a commercial space second. And the intelligence gathered in this building on a Tuesday morning will circulate through the neighbourhood by Thursday afternoon. Inside, you run into Carol from 2 streets over almost immediately, which is statistically inevitable. Carol's cart contains things that tell you something about her week. You read them. She reads yours. Neither of you acknowledges doing this. You discuss the weather and the school schedule and the price of everything, which has gone up again, and someone mentions the new family that moved in on Larchwood, and what do you think, and you say something non-committal and file the question away for later. At the butcher counter, you know exactly what to ask for and how to ask for it. Butchers responded, to knowledge. If you came in vaguely requesting something for dinner, you got whatever needed to move. If you came in asking for a specific cut, trimmed a specific way, you were taken seriously. Women who knew their way around a butcher counter were conducting a small daily act of professional competence that had no official name. The budget is in your head. It is precise. There is no credit card. There is cash in an envelope that has been allocated with the kind of attention a CFO gives a quarterly report. You know exactly how much is in it and exactly how far it has to stretch. And if the price of something has gone up since last week, you are doing the arithmetic in real time, while appearing to simply be reading a label thoughtfully. You pay. You load the bags into the car, or into the wheeled cart you've walked from home, depending. You drive back, or walk back, mentally already composing the week's menu from what's in the bags. Before you've pulled out of the parking lot, dinner tomorrow is already planned. The social information gathered in 45 minutes of grocery shopping will require its own separate processing time. You'll think about Carol's cart for the rest of the afternoon, whether you want to or not. In no other decade had kitchen appliances carried quite as much cultural weight. The post-war economic boom flooded American homes with gleaming new machines, electric ranges, automatic washing machines, upright vacuum cleaners, and the women who owned them were expected to feel liberated by them, which some did, and many quietly didn't. A new refrigerator wasn't just a new refrigerator. It was a declaration of your household's position in the social order, admired by neighbours during kitchen tours that were absolutely a thing people did. You understand this. When the Hendersons got a new Frigidaire with a double door and the automatic ice maker, Margaret Henderson mentioned it twice in the span of one Sunday, and everyone noted this, and everyone also went to look at it when invited, because that was the social contract of the era, and the refrigerator was genuinely impressive. It was large, it was white, It hummed with the quiet confidence of something that cost a significant amount of money. The refrigerator was the centerpiece, but it was not alone. The post-war American kitchen was becoming, decade by decade, a laboratory of domestic technology, each new machine promising to return hours to the housewife's day, which in practice meant the hours were returned and then immediately refilled by the rising standard of what the house was now expected to achieve. You had a washing machine, so your family's clothes could be washed more frequently, so they needed to be washed more frequently. You had an electric range with more precise heat control, so your cooking could be more ambitious, so it was expected to be. The vacuum cleaner was a particular example. Before the upright electric vacuum, carpets were beaten outside, which was hard physical labour, but which was also notably done infrequently. With the vacuum cleaner in the house and operational, carpet cleaning went from a seasonal event to a weekly standard, and in some households to a daily one. The machine had not reduced the work, it had raised the floor. This was the sneaky arithmetic of post-war domestic technology, and the women living with it noticed, even when the magazines extolling the new appliances did not. Advertisements for kitchen appliances in the 1950s were a particular art form. They showed women in full dress and lipstick gazing at washing machines with the kind of expression normally reserved for romantic encounters. The copy used words like freedom and modern and effortless. The implicit argument was that technology and domesticity together constituted the ideal American female life, that the gleaming kitchen was the reward for choosing the right path. The women reading these ads had complicated feelings about them that they mostly kept to themselves. The appliances were not, it should be noted, entirely unwelcome. Running water, electric ranges and mechanical washing machines had materially reduced the physical brutality of housework compared to a generation earlier. The women of the 1950s were not nostalgic for washboards. They were simply noticing that the labour-saving promise of each new machine seemed to be followed, almost immediately, by a corresponding increase in what the labour was expected to produce. The kitchen became a showroom, a workspace, and an identity. A well-equipped kitchen said something about you, about your husband's income, your organisational capacity, your modernity, your commitment to the domestic project. When a neighbour came over, she would see the kitchen. She would form conclusions. You kept yours spotless, obviously. The 1950s casserole is perhaps the most honest artefact of the era, a dish that took everything available, covered it in cream of something soup, topped it with crushed crackers, and called it dinner. Women were expected to cook 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, with enthusiasm. Cookbooks of the period read less like recipe collections and more like motivational pamphlets, cheerfully explaining that a well-fed husband was a happy husband, and that a happy husband was the primary goal of a well-ordered female existence. You cook constantly, in the way that breathing is constant, as background condition, as ongoing maintenance of your household's continued functioning. The question is not whether you will cook, but what, and what has variables. The budget, what's in the refrigerator, what the children will actually eat versus what they are supposed to eat, versus what they will eat under protest after a brief negotiation, and what mood the husband is likely to bring home from work, which you have learned to anticipate with a meteorologist's attention to early signs. The casserole emerged as the 1950s solution to several problems simultaneously. It was economical. It could absorb inexpensive cuts of meat, vegetables from the garden, leftover starch from Tuesday's dinner. It was scalable. Feeding 4 or feeding 8 was largely a question of dish size. It was make ahead, which was genuinely useful in a household where the afternoon could go sideways at any moment. And it presented well, arriving at the table in its baking dish looking intentional and complete, which is more than could be said for some improvised weeknight dinners. The cream of mushroom soup that appears in approximately 60% of recipes from this era was not, strictly speaking, a culinary choice. It was a structural material. It functioned as binder, sauce, and flavour delivery systems simultaneously, and it had the considerable virtue of being shelf-stable and available at any grocery store in the country. You could build a casserole around cream of mushroom soup the way a contractor builds, a house around a load-bearing wall. It was the thing that held everything else together, and questioning its role seemed unnecessarily philosophical for a Tuesday evening. The Jell-O salad deserves its own examination, because the Jell-O salad was the 1950s in dessert form, cheerful, colourful, architecturally ambitious, and containing vegetables that had no business being in gelatin. The suspended carrot, the floating celery, the shredded cabbage held in aspic at a slightly aggressive angle. These were not accidents. These were recipe-tested, magazine-published creations prepared by women who'd been told that modern cooking was creative cooking, and who applied that instruction with a literal commitment that the recipe developers may not have fully anticipated. Cooking was also, quietly, one of the few domains in which a 1950s housewife held genuine authority. In the kitchen, you made decisions. You determined what the family ate, which gave you a subtle but real form of power that the era's rhetoric about selfless domesticity tended to obscure. And if you happened to make a dish that your husband particularly disliked, on a night when you were particularly tired and he had been particularly unhelpful, well, accidents happen in any kitchen. The cookbooks did not discuss this. The cookbooks discussed presentation. Dinner arrived at the table hot, complete, and unaccompanied by any visible evidence of the afternoon it had taken to produce it. That was the standard. You met it every evening without being asked to. The casserole was delicious. You had made it 100 times. You could make it in your sleep, which some evenings was approximately the state you were in. The arrival of the husband at the end of the workday was a moment that the entire household schedule had been quietly building towards since dawn. The children were meant to be scrubbed. The house was meant to smell of something warm. The wife was meant to be calm and pleased, to see him, regardless of what kind of day she'd actually had. Etiquette guides of the era gently suggested that a wife remove herself to the bathroom briefly before 6 to refresh her lipstick, because first impressions mattered even after 10 years of marriage, apparently. You hear the car in the driveway. You've been hearing it in your mind for the last 20 minutes, listening for it the way you listen for weather, not with dread, exactly, but with alertness, with the adjustment of internal settings that happens when a variable you've been managing around becomes present in the room. The children are called in from wherever they've migrated to. Hair is smoothed, hands are checked. The kitchen contains the smell of dinner at a productive stage, not finished, which would suggest you hadn't timed it correctly to his arrival, and not raw, which would suggest you were behind. The transitional smell of something almost ready as the target. Warm, promising, under control. He comes through the door. He's tired, or distracted, or in a good mood. And you read this within approximately 4 seconds because you've been doing it for years, and it is information you need. The day's emotional weather is his to bring home and yours to absorb and redirect, which is one of those asymmetries of the 1950s marriage that no one had yet developed the language to describe, though the women living inside them felt it clearly enough. You take his coat. You bring his drink, bourbon on the rocks if it's been that kind of week, beer if it hasn't, and the distinction is one you track without being asked to track it. He settles into his chair. The newspaper is there. The children, briefly, demonstrate their continued existence and general acceptability. You return to the kitchen. This is the dinner hour, which is misnamed because it implies a single hour, and the preparation has been going on since 3. What happens in this window between his arrival and the food? Reaching the table is a sustained performance of effortlessness. You're managing the stove, supervising a child who has remembered homework approximately 40 minutes too late, listening to whatever he's saying from the living room, and mentally running the next 6 steps of dinner preparation simultaneously. You look calm. You're not doing nothing. You're doing 8 things. The distinction is invisible by design. Dinner is eaten at the table. This is not optional. The family dinner was a near sacred institution in 1950s domestic life. The proof that the household functioned as designed, that children were being raised in an orderly environment, that the marriage was intact, that everything was fine. Conversation over dinner was managed. Arguments were deferred. The children were encouraged to share something from their day, which they did with varying degrees of reliability. He finished eating. You had been eating and also refilling things and also watching whether the children were eating their vegetables and also being present in the conversation while being partly somewhere else. He went back to his chair. You cleared the table. You would do it all again tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. The etiquette guides called this maintaining the home. You called it nothing, because there wasn't really a word for it that captured the full dimensions of the job. Life in the post-war suburb was lived in extraordinarily close proximity to other people who were all performing the same act simultaneously. Fences were low, windows faced windows, children ran between yards freely. This meant neighbours knew your business whether you invited them to or not, and the ones who were paying closest attention were always the ones who seemed most busy with their own. The neighbourhood was social scaffolding, useful, supportive, and occasionally load-bearing in ways that had nothing to do with architecture. Your block the way you know your kitchen, which counter holds what, which drawer sticks, which neighbour is reliable in a crisis, and which one will tell everyone about it immediately afterward. The two are not always separate people. Barbara across the street is both. You appreciate this about her in a complicated way. The neighbourhood operated on a system of visible signals. A house with its curtains still drawn at 9 in the morning meant someone was sick, or someone was having a difficult week, or, and this was the one people really wanted to know about, something was happening in that marriage. The garden said things, the car said things, the way you answered the door said things. The 1950s suburb was a place of significant involuntary transparency, and the response to this was not to stop broadcasting, but to get much better at curating what you broadcast. You learnt to be fine. Not actually fine, genuinely fine was a variable state available to everyone on some days and nobody on all of them, but visibly, publicly, on the street fine. You walked to the mailbox with purpose. You greeted people warmly. If something was wrong inside the house, it stayed inside the house, and the house's exterior, the lawn, the paint, the curtains, the general impression of orderly domestic operation, communicated nothing but competence. This required energy, a sustained, quiet, continuous expenditure of energy that lived in the space between your actual interior state and the one you were presenting, and that gap, wide some days, narrow others, was nobody's business but yours. Community was real, though, alongside the performance. When a woman on the block had a baby, meals appeared on her porch without organisation. It simply happened through the organic coordination of women who understood exactly what a new mother needed and didn't wait to be asked. When someone's husband was in the hospital, children were absorbed into neighbouring households without comment. When the weather broke a pipe, there were people at the door with tools inside the hour. This is what the post-war suburb was, alongside everything else it was. A functional mutual aid society that nobody called that, staffed almost entirely by women, operating on the informal currency of reciprocal attention and care. It required proximity and repetition, and the kind of knowledge of other people's lives that only comes from living alongside them long enough to understand what they need before they say it. The surveillance and the support were not separate systems. They were the same system, run by the same people, on the same block, on the same quiet Tuesday morning. You waved to Barbara across the street. She waved back. Both of you knew the wave contained more information than it appeared to. The mid-morning coffee clatch, a gathering of neighbourhood women, usually in someone's kitchen, usually involving a coffee cake that was somehow both dense and ethereal, was officially described as a casual social visit. Enroll? Practice. It was one of the only spaces in a 1950s Housewives week where she could speak freely, complain gently, speculate wildly, and be understood completely by people living the exact same life in the houses immediately surrounding hers. What was said over those coffee cups would have made the husbands significantly more nervous than they were. It begins around 9:30, after the children are in school and the husbands are at work, and the morning's first wave of housework has been addressed enough that leaving the kitchen for an hour feels technically defensible. You walk to whoever's hosting. It rotates loosely, without formal scheduling, in the way that arrangements between women who see each other every day don't need to be formal, and you bring something, a plate of something, because arriving without a contribution is not done. The kitchen is warm, the coffee is already on. There are 4 of you, or 5, depending on who has a conflicting errand or a particularly demanding child situation today. You sit, and you pour, and for approximately the first 4 minutes the conversation is about the weather, and the children and whatever immediate neighbourhood event has provided the week's opening material. Then someone says something real. It might be small, a comment about being tired, delivered in a tone that carries more weight than its words, or it might be larger, a piece of information about a marriage or a money situation or a health scare that has been contained all week, and is finally being set down where it can breathe, and the room adjusts, the way rooms adjust when the social register shifts from performance to honesty, and suddenly you're all having the actual conversation. These conversations had no names in 1953. They were not therapy. There was no framework. They were not activism. No one was organising anything officially. They were simply women in a kitchen talking to each other about their actual lives, with a particular candour available when everyone present is living a sufficiently similar version of the same experience that nothing requires much explanation. You could say, "I am so tired," without specifying why, and be understood completely. You could say, "He doesn't see me," and communicate an entire architecture of longing and frustration in 4 words. You could laugh about something that was not technically funny, and have the laugh returned with full comprehension of what was being laughed at and what underneath it was not funny at all. The coffee cake got eaten, more coffee got poured, someone's child came home for a forgotten lunch and was fed and sent back. The conversation moved through several territories, something light, something serious, something that made everyone laugh until someone nearly spilled her cup, and then settled, eventually, into the comfortable quiet of women who have said what needed saying and are now simply sitting together in it. By 11, you were back home. The kitchen was waiting. The afternoon was ahead. You felt, for reasons that were not easy to articulate to anyone who hadn't been in that kitchen, considerably better equipped for it. The post-war baby boom dropped an extraordinary number of children into households that were, ideologically speaking, not entirely prepared for them. Women were expected to be natural mothers, instinctively nurturing, infinitely patient, and largely unbothered by the relentless physical and psychological demands of raising multiple children in rapid succession, with no childcare, no parental leave, and no one officially acknowledging that it was, in fact, quite a lot. Dr. Spock had recently published his childcare Bible, and mothers were expected to have read it, absorbed it, and applied it without appearing to try. You have children. 2 or 3 or 4, the era's cultural expectation tended toward more rather than fewer, and the space between children in a 1950s family was measured in years rather than the careful planning that came later. They are small people with large needs and a complete absence of interest in the domestic logistics surrounding them, which is developmentally appropriate and also, on a practical level, relentless. Dr. Spock's Baby and Child Care, published in 1946, had landed in American households with the force of a new religion. It told mothers to trust their instincts, which sounds liberating until you realize it was being said to women who had been told for decades that their instincts in nearly every domain were inferior to expert opinion, and who were now being told to trust the instincts they had never been permitted to develop. The book was warm, accessible, and genuinely useful in many respects. It was also 300 pages of something else on the daily to-do list. The children needed feeding, and the feeding was constant in the particular way young children are constant, not always hungry at the same time, not always interested in what was prepared, occasionally interested in things that were not food. They needed clothing that required washing and mending and replacing as they grew out of it, on a schedule that seemed deliberately timed to be inconvenient. They needed supervision in the yard and homework managed in the evenings, and the school's periodic communications about their progress, which arrived in the form of notes home that could mean anything from excellent to please come in immediately. They got sick. This was the development in a household with no backup system that functioned like a small natural disaster. Suddenly the entire day structure was gone, replaced by a child on the couch requiring attention and liquids, and the particular comfort of a mother physically present in the room, and also still requiring dinner and clean laundry, and all the rest of it continuing in the background. You were the medical system. Dr. Spock covered some of this. For the rest, you relied on what your own mother had told you, what the neighbour who was a former nurse had mentioned in passing, and a working knowledge of when something was serious enough to warrant the actual doctor, which cost money and was therefore a judgment call every time. And yet, the children were also the point, in a way that existed alongside and sometimes in tension with everything else. Not the point in the self-abnegating way the era's ideology would have it, that a woman's fulfillment was entirely located in her children's flourishing, but in a simpler, more complicated way. They were interesting. They were surprising. They said things that stopped you mid-task. They were growing constantly and visibly into people, and watching that happen had a quality to it that existed outside the labour it required. You just wished, occasionally, that someone else noticed what the labour required. In 1950s suburban America, the car was freedom, and in many households it was the husband's, freedom specifically. Many families had one car, the husband drove it to work, the wife was left with the house, the children, and whatever was within walking distance, which was often not much. On weekends the car came home, and the family piled into it for errands or Sunday drives or visits to relatives nobody particularly wanted to visit. The women who did learn to drive described it in terms that suggested they had quietly claimed back something important. The post-war suburb had been built around the assumption of the car. Distances between things, the grocery store, the school, the doctor's office, the dry cleaner, were calibrated for someone with access to a vehicle, which meant that on the days the car was gone, the geography of your life contracted significantly. You were functionally home. The children were home. The refrigerator contained what it contained, and if it didn't contain what you needed, that was a problem to solve creatively rather than one to solve with a quick trip out. Some women walked. This was fine in good weather, less fine in February with 2 children and a bag of groceries, and quietly understood by everyone in the neighbourhood to represent a particular domestic circumstance, the single-car household, the husband who needed it, the wife who was managing. Nobody said anything about this directly. Nobody needed to. The women who had their own car, either a second household car, which was becoming more common as the decade progressed, or access to the family car on a reliable schedule, spoke about it in ways that were disproportionate to the thing itself. They drove to the grocery store and back and described the drive with a lightness that was not really about driving. It was about the 15 minutes alone in a moving vehicle, with no one asking anything of them, going somewhere they had chosen to go, at a speed they had selected, with the radio on whatever station they preferred, it was by any reasonable modern standard a very small thing. In the context of a life that was almost entirely organised around the needs of other people, it was not small at all. Learning to drive, for women who hadn't done it before marriage, was its own particular act of quiet self-expansion. Driving lessons in the era were sometimes conducted by the husband, which introduced dynamics that did not always make the learning easier, and sometimes by a driving school, which was considerably more effective and also removed the variable of someone gripping the dashboard in the passenger seat. Women who learned to drive as adults in the 1950s almost universally remembered the experience clearly, which tells you something about what it represented. The Sunday family drive was a ritual of the era that looked, from the outside, like leisure, and from the inside was frequently more complicated. The family loaded into the car, children in the back, no seatbelts, an arrangement that produced a particular travelling chaos and went somewhere. The somewhere was often vague: a scenic route, a drive-in for ice cream, a loop through a neighbourhood where slightly larger houses existed as a kind of aspirational tourism. The husband drove. The wife managed the children and navigated if needed and answered questions and kept things from deteriorating. It was not nothing. It was a change of scenery, a break from the house, a reminder that the world was larger than the block. On good days, with the windows down and something decent on the radio and the children briefly quiet in the back, it was genuinely pleasant. The car pulled back into the driveway. Everyone got out. The house was where you'd left it. You went inside and started thinking about dinner. By the late 1950s and into the 60s, tranquilizer prescriptions for American housewives had reached numbers that today read less like medical statistics and more like a distress signal in pharmacological form. Doctors prescribed them freely for what was described in clinical language as anxiety, nervousness, and domestic fatigue. Conditions that, if you read between the lines of the era's medical literature, were essentially what happened when a highly intelligent woman was handed a mop and told it was her calling. Nobody called it a problem. It was just what some women needed to get through the day. The drugs arrived with reassuring names and reassuring doctors, and a social context that made the whole thing seem entirely reasonable. Miltown came first in 1955, and within a year it was the most prescribed drug in American history. It was called a tranquilizer, which was a softer word than sedative, and a much softer word than what it actually was, a medication that turned down the volume on a mind that was producing too much signal for the life it was being asked to live quietly inside. You might not have taken it, or you might have, or you might have known 3 women who did, which at the prescription rates of the late 1950s was statistically likely. The doctor gave them out with the easy confidence of someone solving a presented problem without examining its source. The presented problem was, this woman is anxious, or restless, or not sleeping, or crying without being able to explain why. The solution was, here is something to make that quieter. The question of why was not, generally, the direction the appointment went. It worked, in the way that turning down the volume on something works. The sound was still there, but you could no longer hear it clearly enough to act on it. Women who took tranquilizers in this period described feeling smoothed out, functional, capable of moving through the day without the edges that had been catching on things. This was considered a success. The sherry was older than the prescription drugs and considerably less medicalized. A glass in the afternoon, in the privacy of the kitchen, was not something anyone tracked or reported. It was a domestic, constant in enough households of the era that it barely registered as a habit, just a feature of the kitchen between 3 and 5, like the sound of the radio or the smell of dinner starting. The social context around women's afternoon drinking was shaped by the same mechanism that shaped most things women did in private. Nobody was officially looking, so the looking that did happen was informal, neighbour to neighbour, conducted in the vocabulary of concern rather than judgment most of the time. What nobody named, not the doctors, not the magazines, not the etiquette guides, and certainly not the husbands, was the underlying architecture. The anxiety being treated was real. The restlessness was real. The persistent, low-grade sense of living inside a life that was slightly too small, that had been designed to fit a particular theory of female happiness that didn't account for the actual dimensions of the person inside it, that was real too. Betty Friedan would eventually call it the problem that has no name in 1963, and the recognition that rippled through women who read it, the sense of being seen, finally, in something that had been invisible, was its own kind of diagnosis. But in 1957, it had no name. It had a prescription. You took it, or you poured a glass, or you did neither and simply kept going, which was also a choice, and also had costs. The day continued regardless. There was still dinner. Women's magazines of the 1950s operated as a kind of parallel reality maintenance system. They were full of recipes, decorating tips, beauty advice, and articles with titles like "Are You the Wife Your Husband Deserves?", delivered in a warm, supportive tone that somehow made the question feel encouraging rather than accusatory. Every issue reinforced the same message in slightly different arrangements. The home was the woman's domain. The woman's happiness was the home's happiness. And any dissatisfaction was a personal failure rather than a structural one. You subscribed to at least two. Everyone did. They arrived in the mailbox with their glossy covers, a woman smiling in a perfect kitchen, a perfectly arranged table, a perfectly turned-out child in the background, and you brought them inside and set them on the counter and flipped through them in whatever fragment of unscheduled time presented itself, which was usually while something was on the stove. The recipes were useful. This has to be acknowledged. In an era before the internet and before cooking shows and before the accumulated food knowledge of the entire world was available on a small glass rectangle in your pocket, the women's magazine was a genuine resource, a monthly delivery of tested recipes, seasonal menus, and techniques you might not have encountered otherwise. The tuna noodle casserole that became a family staple arrived via a magazine. So did the method for properly folding a fitted sheet, which nobody had been born knowing and which the magazine presented as both achievable and important. But surrounding the recipes was an editorial architecture that had its own agenda. The articles, the advice columns, the features on how to keep your marriage fresh, and the art of the perfect hostess and is your home as happy as it could be, which was really asking whether you were as happy as you were supposed to be, in language designed to make the question feel like a helpful nudge rather than a mild accusation. The advertising was doing the same work in a different register. Every product being sold in the pages of a women's magazine in the 1950s was sold against the same backdrop. A woman whose fulfillment was domestic, whose aspirations were residential, whose highest achievement was a gleaming surface and a grateful family. The floor wax advertisement and the cake mix advertisement and the appliance advertisement all shared the same visual grammar. The woman in them was always happy. She was always home. Her happiness and her home were the same thing. What the magazines were extraordinarily good at was making dissatisfaction feel individual. If you were unhappy, if the life described in the pages didn't match the experience of living it, the implicit message was that you were doing something wrong, that the correct execution of the project would produce the promised result, and that the gap between the magazine and your kitchen was a gap in your performance, rather than a gap in the premise. Women read these magazines in quantities that their publishers found very encouraging, which is worth noting. They were not passive recipients of an ideology. They were active participants in a conversation about domestic life that they clearly wanted to be having. The magazines were read, argued with, clipped for their recipes, occasionally thrown across the room. You kept them in a stack by the chair. You'd read last month's twice already. The new one had just arrived. The cover showed a woman in a kitchen that was definitely not as clean as yours, somehow looking significantly more relaxed. You opened it. You started with the recipes. Not every 1950s housewife was reading Good Housekeeping. Some were reading Simone de Beauvoir. Some had found their way to early feminist essays passed between women, in the quiet way that genuinely dangerous ideas tend to travel, hand to hand, in brown paper covers, left accidentally on purpose in each other's kitchens. The ideas in these books that a woman was a full human being with intellectual needs and political rights and something to contribute beyond a well-seasoned pot roast were not new, technically. But in the context of 1953, they felt like a window opening in a room that had been sealed shut for a decade. The reading happened in the hours that belonged to no one, after 9 when the house was quiet, or in the 20 minutes before the children came home from school, or on a Saturday afternoon when circumstances had aligned in a way that produced a pocket of unscheduled time. You took the book from where it was kept, which was not always on the open shelf in the living room, and you sat somewhere with good light, and you read. Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex had been published in French in 1949 and translated into English in 1953. It was not a casual read. It was dense, philosophical, occasionally infuriating, and described the condition of women with a clarity that produced in its readers, many of them sitting in the kitchens that the book was, in a sense, about, something between recognition and vertigo. It named things that had been present but unlabelled. It provided a framework for experiences that had previously been managed as personal idiosyncrasies. The book was not considered appropriate reading material for housewives, which had no official enforcement mechanism but did have a social one. A woman reading de Beauvoir was operating in a register that didn't fit easily into the 1950s domestic performance. Ideas, once engaged with seriously, had a way of making the performance harder to sustain, and the performance was load-bearing enough that anything weakening it was viewed with some concern by the people whose lives depended on its continuation. So the reading was often private, in the way that private things in the 1950s were private, not locked away, but not advertised either, kept on the less visible shelf, discussed with the one friend who was also reading it, in the coffee clatch's quieter register, lent and returned with a particular look that communicated more than the exchange of a book. The effect was cumulative and irreversible. This is the thing about ideas that accurately describe your experience. Once you've encountered them, you cannot unencounter them. The framework, once built, reorganizes everything around it. Things you'd been managing as personal problems, the boredom, the restlessness, the sense of partial existence, suddenly had structural explanations. It wasn't you. It was the arrangement. This was both a relief and a problem. A relief because it lifted the weight of individual failure. A problem because the arrangement was very large and very stable, and you were inside it with a family and a mortgage, and nowhere immediately obvious to put this new information. Most women who were reading these books in the 1950s did not immediately walk out of their lives. They sat with what they'd read. They thought about it. They discussed it carefully with people they trusted. They waited and read more and continued doing the dishes and held the window open in their minds for something they couldn't yet fully name. The book went back on the shelf. You started dinner, but you kept thinking about page 47. Alfred Kinsey published his landmark reports on human sexuality in 1948 and 1953, and the America he described was considerably more complicated than the one being depicted in television commercials. The polite fiction of the era held that married suburban couples had wholesome, infrequent, entirely functional, intimate lives, and that anything beyond this was happening somewhere else, to other people. What was actually happening, per Kinsey's meticulous and somewhat startling data, was considerably more varied, more frequent, and far more interesting. Kinsey's first report on male sexuality had landed in 1948 with the force of something that couldn't be put back. His numbers on extramarital affairs, on sexual variety, on the gap between public behaviour and private behaviour, had produced in the American public a reaction that moved through disbelief, outrage, and reluctant recognition in roughly that order. His 1953 report on female sexuality was, if anything, more disruptive because it described women as having active, complex sexual lives with desires and experiences that the culture's dominant story about women and sex had not accounted for. The culture's dominant story was this: women were the brakes, men drove the car, women applied the brakes, marriage was the chassis that made the whole arrangement respectable, and anything beyond this framework was somebody else's problem happening somewhere else. The wife in the suburban house was not officially a sexual being in the full sense. She was a wife, which was a related but socially managed category. What Kinsey found, surveying thousands of women across America, was a population whose actual experience was substantially richer and more complicated than the story being told about it. Women were having satisfying intimate lives and unsatisfying ones and absent ones and secret ones. They had feelings about all of it. These feelings were not being discussed with their husbands in any systematic way, because the 1950s marriage did not generally provide a conversational structure for that kind of exchange. They were occasionally discussed with friends, in the oblique vocabulary of women who'd learned to talk around things they could not talk about directly. The gap between the public script and the private reality was one of the defining features of post-war American domestic life, and the sexual dimension of that gap was significant. Women who had desires that didn't fit the available framework, who found their marriages less than they had been told to expect, or who found themselves wanting things the culture had no polite name for, managed this primarily alone, in the interior space between the person they were and the person they were presenting. Some found each other. The friendships between women in this era carried more weight than was socially acknowledged, and some of those friendships crossed into territory the era's vocabulary couldn't accommodate. These relationships existed in the space between what was possible and what was permissible, and the women inside them understood both the value of what they had and the cost of its visibility. Kinsey's data sat in the culture like an open question that nobody in authority was rushing to answer. The reports were discussed in whispers at dinner parties, debated in magazines that covered the controversy without fully engaging its implications, and purchased in quantities that suggested a population eager to know what was actually happening behind everyone else's closed doors. You'd heard about the reports, everyone had. You'd thought about what they meant for longer than you'd told anyone. The geography of the 1950s suburb, houses close together, husbands gone all day, afternoons long and unstructured, created conditions that were, historically speaking, not unfamiliar to anyone who had spent time studying human nature in enclosed spaces. Affairs happened. They happened in the way that things happen when people are lonely and bored and living inside, a performance of happiness that doesn't quite fit. They were rarely discussed and almost never acknowledged, which gave them a strange, suspended quality, present enough to reshape a neighbourhood's social architecture while officially not existing at all. The loneliness is where it starts, and the loneliness requires some explaining because it existed alongside a life that was technically never empty. You were surrounded by people at almost all times, children, neighbours, the husband in the evening, the social infrastructure of the neighbourhood ticking along steadily around you. And yet, there is a particular kind of loneliness that arrives not from absence but from non-recognition, from being present in a life where the person you actually are is not quite visible to the people around you. That variety of loneliness was structural in the 1950s housewife's experience, and it was real, and it needed somewhere to go. Sometimes it went into books or friendships or the carefully maintained interior life that many women of the era carried without discussing. Sometimes it expressed itself differently. The affair of the 1950s suburb was not generally a grand romantic narrative. It was quieter than that, a connection with a neighbour's husband, or the hardware store owner, or someone's brother who came to visit one summer, that began in the ordinary currency of being truly seen by another person, and escalated in the way things escalate when two people who are both somewhat starving for recognition are spending time in proximity. The neighbourhood tracked it. The neighbourhood always tracked it, with the same passive, comprehensive attention it brought to everything else. A car parked somewhere it wasn't expected. Two people leaving the same party at intervals that were slightly too calculated. A shift in the social atmosphere between two households that communicated something had changed without specifying what. The women of the neighbourhood were excellent readers of these signals, having spent years in close proximity to each other's lives with the full attention that comes from having few other outlets for that level of observation. What happened with the information varied. Some neighbourhoods operated on a don't-ask architecture. The knowledge circulated but was never formalised, never brought into the open, held in a kind of collective suspension that allowed everyone to continue functioning. Others were less generous, and the social consequences for a woman identified as having an affair were considerably steeper than for a man in the same situation, which was a disparity that everyone understood and that no one in authority was in a hurry to address. The husband's affairs were also happening, in roughly the numbers Kinsey had suggested, but they occupied a different cultural register, less tracked by the neighbourhood, more likely to be absorbed into a marriage's official silence, understood as a thing that happened, without becoming a thing that restructured everything. This asymmetry was not invisible to the women it affected. It was filed alongside other things, in the interior space where the gap between the official story and the real one was maintained. The loneliness that started it often didn't resolve when it ended. Sometimes it was worse. You watched Barbara's kitchen light for a moment longer than you meant to one evening. You went back inside and didn't think about why. The 1950s book club was doing considerably more work than it was given credit for. Officially, it was a social gathering, a monthly excuse for women to leave the house in the evening without raising eyebrows. Unofficially, it was where some of the sharpest minds in any given neighbourhood, minds that had been to college, in many cases, and then been handed an apron, went to think out loud, argue about ideas, and remember that they were in fact capable of having opinions about things other than floor wax. You got ready for book club differently than you got ready for anything else in the domestic calendar. There was still the lipstick, still the hair, but something in the preparation was lighter, less armour, more anticipation. You were going somewhere for your own reasons, which was an event distinct enough to carry its own specific quality in the evening. The book had been selected a month ago, and you had read it, which was not as automatic as it sounds given the constraints on uninterrupted reading time in a household with children. You had read it in pieces, 10 pages here, 20 minutes there, but you had read it, and you had thought about it, and you had things to say. This last part was the point. The books were not always literary. Some months it was a novel from the bestseller list, something well reviewed and widely discussed. Other months it was a historical biography, or something a member had recommended with particular enthusiasm, and these were the evenings that tended to run longest and leave everyone slightly charged, something that touched even obliquely on the conditions of the lives being lived by the people in the room. The conversation started with the book and migrated. This was the reliable structure of every meeting. A period of dutiful engagement with the actual text, during which opinions were formed and exchanged and challenged with a seriousness that the social context of the era otherwise did not provide for, followed by a gradual widening outward into everything else. Something in the novel about a character's constrained choices would open into a conversation about constrained choices in general, and suddenly 6 women who had not been talking about their lives were talking about their lives with all the analytical energy that the book had unlocked. Some women in these clubs had college degrees that they were not currently using in any form the degree would recognise. Some had had careers before marriage, had been teachers or writers, or worked in offices where their intelligence had been formally acknowledged and compensated, and had set those things down at the altar of domestic life with varying degrees of willingness. The book club was where some of that capacity went, not to waste exactly, but into an hour and a half of close reading and sharp argument, and the particular pleasure of being intellectually met by people who were actually paying attention. The husbands knew about the book clubs. Most of them approved it was a wholesome social activity, structured around literature, conducted in someone's living room. What they didn't necessarily clock was what was being discussed inside it, which was not always entirely about the book. You drove home at 10:30 with the specific alertness of someone whose mind has been used recently. The house was quiet. The husband was asleep. You sat in the kitchen for a while before you went to bed. You were still thinking about what Susan had said about the 3rd chapter. Religious life in 1950s America was both genuinely felt and socially mandatory, and the line between the two was not always easy to locate. Women ran the practical life of most congregations, the potlucks, the charity drives, the Sunday school, the visits to the sick, while the theology and the authority remained officially in the hands of the men. Church was also one of the primary ways a new family established itself in a neighbourhood, and a woman who didn't appear in the pew on Sunday mornings was the subject of a quiet but persistent conversation among the women who did. Sunday morning had its own choreography, distinct from every other morning in the week's schedule and considerably more demanding in the 30 minutes before departure. The children needed to be in their good clothes, which existed in a state of permanent war with their natural tendencies toward dirt and motion. The husband needed to be presentable. You needed to be, by the standards the occasion required, impeccable, because church was a public performance of family values, and you were its primary staging manager. The faith itself was, for many women, genuinely held. This is important not to lose in the sociological description of the era. The 1950s was a period of high religious participation in America. Church attendance was near its historical peak, and the reasons were not entirely social. Women who prayed meant it. Women who found comfort in the liturgy were genuinely comforted. The structure of religious life, the weekly rhythm of it, the sense of something larger than the domestic calendar, the community it produced, met real needs in real ways. But church was also infrastructure. The women's auxiliary, the ladies' circle, the committee structures that organised the congregation's practical existence. These were run by women with the same organisational competence they brought to everything else, applied now to a slightly larger enterprise. You knew who was sick on your visiting list. You knew which family had just had a new baby and needed a meal train organised. You knew whose husband had lost his job and would need the charity fund handled with enough discretion that it didn't become the neighbourhood's primary topic for the month. The social contract of the pew operated on a currency of mutual visibility. You saw and were seen weekly, and your presence or absence communicated things. A family that stopped attending was a family something had happened to. Divorce, illness, financial disaster, or some moral difficulty that made the Sunday morning performance no longer sustainable. The congregation noticed, and in noticing, closed ranks or extended sympathy depending on the specifics. The minister spoke about family, about wifely virtue, about the divine sanction of the domestic life. This was 1953, and the theology of American Protestantism had made a reasonably comfortable peace with the suburban family as its operating unit. The sermons were warm, practical, and broadly encouraging of exactly the life you were already living, which was either a confirmation or a constraint depending on what you brought with you into the pew. You sang the hymns. You meant some of them more than others. After the service, the social hour, coffee in the fellowship hall, children running circuits around the folding tables, the week's news moving through the congregation. In the efficient, organic way news moves through any community that sees itself every 7 days without fail. You drove home. The good clothes came off. Sunday dinner was already planned. You had 3 committees meeting this week, all of which you were running. The 1950s had a word for women who expressed chronic unhappiness with their domestic circumstances, and that word was neurotic. The American psychiatric establishment of the period was not, on the whole, asking itself whether the circumstances might be the problem. Women who reported persistent sadness, anxiety, loss of purpose, or the creeping sense that they were disappearing into their own households were offered diagnoses, medications, and occasional hospitalization, treatments calibrated to return them to functional domesticity, not to address the conditions that had brought them there. You went to the doctor because you hadn't been sleeping well, or because the crying had been happening more than it used to, or because there was a feeling you couldn't name that sat in your chest like something that needed to move and couldn't find a direction. You described it as best you could. You were a precise and articulate person. You'd always been good with language, and still the description came out in pieces because the thing didn't have a shape yet. It was more like a pressure, a persistent low-grade wrongness that you couldn't locate in any specific event or cause. The doctor listened. He was not unkind. He had a full waiting room and a framework that had been built on the assumption that women's psychological distress was primarily biological or temperamental in origin, a question of nervous systems and hormonal states, and the particular fragility that the era's medical literature attributed to the female constitution. The framework was not designed to look outside itself for structural explanations, and it didn't. He wrote a prescription. He suggested you try to rest more, which was advice delivered with genuine good intention, and essentially no acknowledgement of what resting more would require in a household of your configuration. He may have said something about the importance of not being too hard on yourself, which was the 1950s medical equivalent of have you tried turning it off and on again. The psychiatric profession of the era was, to be fair, operating at the edge of genuinely limited knowledge. The understanding of depression, anxiety, and the relationship between environment and mental health was significantly less sophisticated than what came later. But the particular blindness of the period, its systematic failure to consider what it might mean for a highly capable person to have their entire life organized around tasks that didn't require their full capacity, was not simply a knowledge gap. It was a choice made in a context that found the alternative explanation considerably less convenient. Women who were hospitalized, and some were, for depression severe enough that outpatient management was insufficient, often describe the experience as a suspension of normal time rather than a treatment. You were removed from the household that was, in some sense, the source of the difficulty, placed in an environment that asked nothing of you domestically, and then returned, stabilized, to the same household and the same conditions, now additionally carrying the social weight of having been hospitalized, which the era managed with a discretion that was intended as kindness and often functioned as isolation. The women who came through these experiences and kept going, who metabolized the gap between what was wrong and what was being treated, who found other outlets and other frameworks for understanding themselves, who survived by finding in friendships or reading or small private acts of self-determination some piece of what the official structure wasn't providing, were doing something that required genuine resilience. They did it without being told they were doing something remarkable. They were. It was. Not every woman in the 1950s was a housewife. Millions worked in factories, in offices, in schools, in shops, though the cultural machinery of the era worked hard to make them feel that this was temporary, a placeholder, something to do until the real life of marriage and housekeeping commenced. Women who remained in the workforce after marriage, by choice or necessity, occupied a strange cultural position, too working to be properly feminine, too feminine to be properly taken seriously professionally. They navigated both worlds with a dexterity that the era gave them no credit for. You might be a teacher, which was the one professional role the era had made a kind of cultural peace with for married women. It involved children, it ended at 3, and it could be framed as an extension of the nurturing domestic role, rather than a departure from it. You might be a nurse, which operated under similar logic. You might be a secretary, which was its own complicated territory, a role that required intelligence, organisational capacity, and professional competence, and was compensated and categorised in ways that suggested none of these qualities were what was primarily being valued. You got to the office earlier than your male colleagues because you had done the morning before coming in, the children, the breakfast, the dispatch of the household into its daily configuration. You would leave punctually because the afternoon had its own requirements, the school pickup, the grocery stop, the beginning of dinner. In between, you worked. You did the job competently, which was noticed and also managed carefully. Women who were too visibly competent generated discomfort in work environments calibrated around a different assumption, and calibrating your visibility was its own secondary skill. The pay was less. This was not incidental. The post-war wage structure had a systematic differential between male and female workers that was embedded in job classifications, hiring practices, and the general cultural consensus that a woman's income was supplementary. She was working for extras, for pin money, for the second car or the vacation, while the man's income was the real one. This assumption persisted regardless of household reality, and the household realities of women who were working because the family genuinely depended on their income were numerous enough to make the assumption obviously false, if anyone had been looking at the data carefully. The social pressure was consistent. Women who worked were quietly, persistently reminded that their children were paying a price, that the housework was presumably suffering, that something was being sacrificed on the altar of professional ambition, which was itself a phrase applied to women in the 1950s with the same tone reserved for a somewhat suspicious character trait. The women who kept working absorbed this pressure with varying degrees of equanimity. Some loved their work with a directness that the era's ideology found difficult to accommodate, not as a supplement to their real lives but as part of the substance of them. They went home tired in a way that was different from the tired of full-time housework, a tiredness that had specific professional content that was attached to achievements and problems and colleagues that didn't vanish when the front door opened. You walked in at 5:30 with a briefcase and an apron waiting. You put the apron on. You started dinner. You were by any reasonable measure doing 2 full-time jobs. The era called this making it work. Here are segments 21 through 30, each expanded to approximately 600 words. The post-war suburb was designed for a specific vision of domestic life, and that vision had not consulted the women who would be spending the most time in it. The houses were built far from city centres, far from public transportation, far from other women in many cases, clustered in rings of identical streets with names like Elm and Maple and Brookside that gestured at nature while replacing it with lawn. The stay-at-home wife of the period was, in architectural terms, quite neatly contained, which was either the point, depending on who you asked, or an accident of zoning law. Historians are divided. The Levittown model, mass-produced housing developments built at speed and scale to absorb the post-war population surge, had reproduced itself across the country with minor regional variations. The houses were small by later standards, efficient, identical in their basic geometry, and arranged on streets that curved without going anywhere in particular, a design choice that was partly aesthetic and partly the result of developers following terrain, but that produced in practice neighbourhoods with no clear path out on foot. You would walk in a loop and return to where you started, which was a reasonable metaphor for certain other aspects of the life being conducted inside the houses. The kitchen faced the backyard. This was standard post-war design, and it was presented as a feature. The mother could watch the children while she cooked, supervising from the window without interrupting her work. What it also meant was that the primary occupant of the house spent the majority of her day facing inward, toward the yard and the domestic sphere, rather than outward toward the street and the neighbourhood's public life. The living room faced the street, but the living room was for evenings, for the husband's return, for the performance of family life in its presentable register. The kitchen was where the days actually lived. The distance between houses on a suburban street was calibrated for visual privacy, close enough for community, far enough that you weren't literally looking into each other's windows at all times, though in practice the sightlines were more permeable than the design suggested. You knew your neighbours' routines with the passive accuracy of someone who shared a wall's worth of proximity without sharing the wall. You knew when Carol's lights went on in the morning, and when the Henderson children left for school, and which houses had arguments that were conducted at a volume audible from the sidewalk. The distance to things was the structural problem. The grocery store was a drive. The doctor was a drive. The school, in many suburbs, was a walk for the children and a drive for everything else. The design of these communities assumed continuous car access, and the households that didn't have it, and there were many, particularly in the early part of the decade before the second car became more common, were living in a built environment that had not accounted for them. Women who had grown up in cities or in denser older neighbourhoods described the suburb's spatial logic as disorienting in a way that took time to name. The city had texture, the corner store, the neighbour you passed every morning, the accumulated small social transactions of a walkable environment. The suburb had lawn. It had the car. It had the interior of the house, which was clean and organised and yours to manage, and the backyard, which was the children's, and the street, which was everyone's and therefore no one's in the particular way that shared spaces become no one's when they have no commercial or civic life attached to them. You looked out the kitchen window at the backyard on a Tuesday afternoon in November. The children were in school, the yard was empty. The identical roof lines of the houses behind yours were visible over the fence. You refilled your coffee and went back to what you were doing, which was what you were always doing, which was everything. The Parent-Teacher Association was, on paper, a civic organisation connecting schools and families for the benefit of children. In practice, it was one of the most politically sophisticated operations in any given suburb, run almost entirely by women who'd been told their opinions didn't belong in actual politics, and who had therefore applied those opinions with considerable force and organisational precision to the school system instead. PTA meetings could get extremely tense over things that sounded minor. They were not minor. You joined because everyone joined, and because not joining communicated a disengagement from community that the neighbourhood would note and file, but also, if you were honest, because the PTA was one of the few places in the 1950s Housewives calendar where the work you were doing was explicitly civic, where the effort and intelligence you applied to a problem produced a visible outcome in an institution that existed in the public record, and where your opinions were, at least nominally, the point. The meeting was held on a Tuesday evening in the school's cafeteria, which still smelled of the lunch it had hosted 8 hours earlier. Folding chairs were arranged in rows. The agenda, mimeographed and slightly smudged, was distributed at the door. You had read it in the car. You had opinions about item 4. The president called the meeting to order. She was efficient and formidable, a woman who had run the PTA for 3 years with the quiet authority of someone who had decided this was where her executive capacity was going to go, and who was going to apply it fully. She was both admired and slightly feared, which is the correct ratio for effective leadership in any context. The early agenda items moved quickly: the school carnival budget, the library book drive, the schedule for the spring fundraiser. These were managed. Then came the curriculum discussion, which was where things got interesting, which is to say where the meeting revealed what it actually was. A forum in which women with sophisticated opinions about child development, educational philosophy and community standards expressed those opinions in the acceptable vocabulary of parental concern. The argument was technically about reading materials. It was actually about values, about what the community believed it was building in its children, and what kind of future those children were being prepared for. And the women on different sides of it were applying frameworks that had been developed in kitchens and book clubs and coffee clatches and brought here, finally, into a room where they could be argued out loud. Nobody won cleanly. Nobody expected to. The PTA was a long game. The same people, the same meeting, every month, positions shifting incrementally over time as the accumulated weight of consistent argument eventually moved things. Women who'd been doing this for years understood the timeline. They were patient in ways that people who have been waiting a long time for their opinions to matter tend to be patient. The bake sale was also on the agenda. This was handled in 4 minutes. The bake sale was never the point. It was the price of admission to the meeting that actually mattered. The domestic credential that justified your presence in a room where you were conducting civic life. You drove home at 9:30 having argued clearly and well about something important. The bake sale was handled. You'd signed up for brownies. The silhouette of the 1950s woman, nipped waist, full skirt, improbable posture, did not happen by accident. It happened with significant structural assistance, girdles, cinch belts, and foundation garments that would, in a later decade, be identified as instruments of mild oppression, but were in the 1950s simply described as supportive. Women wore them every day, to the grocery store, to drive the children to school, to stand in their own kitchens. The new look, introduced by Christian Dior in 1947, had brought back an hourglass silhouette that required a considerable amount of engineering to achieve, and achieving it was more or less expected. The girdle went on in the morning with the same matter-of-fact resignation that people apply to any daily process whose discomfort is both acknowledged and considered non-negotiable. It was a significant garment, structured elastic from waist to mid-thigh, occasionally with attached garters for the stockings, designed to compress and redistribute in ways that produced the correct external geometry, regardless of what was happening internally. You put it on. You were now the right shape. You proceeded. The stockings attached to the girdle or to a separate garter belt and required a specific ritual of attaching and smoothing that took longer than seemed reasonable for something that would spend the day being worn under other clothing and seen by approximately nobody. And yet the stockings had to be right. No runs, no twists. The seam straight up the back of the calf, which required either a mirror or a trusted neighbour with good eyes. A crooked seam was the kind of detail other women noticed and that men, bless them, walked directly past without registering. Christian Dior's new look had arrived in post-war America with the force of a pendulum swinging hard in the opposite direction from wartime practicality. The war years had produced women's fashion calibrated for movement, efficiency and the conservation of fabric, boxy shoulders, shorter hemlines, sensible shoes. Dior swung the pendulum back to a silhouette that required more fabric, more structure, and significantly, more physical engineering. It was simultaneously luxurious, retrograde, and enormously influential, and the American fashion industry reproduced it at every price point, until it was simply what women's clothes looked like. The full skirt that defined the era required crinolines, stiff-net petticoats worn underneath to achieve the correct volume and movement. Putting on a crinoline was a commitment, Sitting down in a crinoline was an architectural challenge. Getting into a car while wearing a crinoline required a specific technique that women who wore them regularly had simply internalized, the way you internalize any physical adaptation demanded by your environment often enough. The shoes were heels. Not always very high heels. The kitten heel was common and merciful, but heels nonetheless, which change posture, gait, and the relationship between your feet and the ground in ways that the day's standing and cooking and child managing and general physical labour made genuinely uncomfortable by 4 in the afternoon. You wore them anyway. The alternative was flat shoes, which existed but communicated something about your relationship to effort that you might not want to communicate on any given Tuesday. The whole system, girdle, stockings, crinoline, heels, the carefully constructed exterior that presented you to the world as a specific kind of woman, took time and money and daily physical endurance to maintain. It was a full-body project, and it produced something beautiful in its way. The photographs of the era have a particular visual coherence, a clarity of aesthetic intention. You looked correct, you looked finished, your feet hurt by lunchtime. You had 7 more hours to go. When television came into the American home in force in the early 1950s, it arrived like a benevolent occupation. By mid-decade, millions of households had a set in the living room, a large, heavy piece of furniture with a small grey screen that broadcast, among other things, a relentless mirror image of the domestic life unfolding just a few feet away from it. The housewife on television was cheerful, organised, and wore heels while vacuuming. She never seemed bored. She never seemed to want anything. She set an impossible standard and then smiled about it, and the women watching from their actual couches processed this in ways the networks had not entirely anticipated. The set arrived in your living room and rearranged it immediately. The furniture, the sofa, the chairs, the coffee table rotated to face it the way sunflowers face the light, and the room's social geometry changed overnight. Before television, the living room had faced inward, furniture arranged to facilitate conversation, to create the conditions for people in a room to engage with each other. After television, it faced a screen. The conversation continued around the edges of what was being watched, but the screen had become the room's organising principle, and that was a significant shift that nobody fully registered while it was happening, because it was gradual, and also because the programming was genuinely compelling. The domestic comedies were the relevant genre for understanding what television was doing to and for the 1950s housewife. I Love Lucy, The Donna Reed Show, Father Knows Best. These programs depicted married women in domestic settings with a glossy, cheerful precision that bore a particular relationship to the lives of the women watching them, close enough to be recognizable, different enough to be aspirational, simplified enough to be narrative. Lucy Ricardo was funny and beloved and repeatedly thwarted by a world that didn't fully accommodate her ambitions, which was a premise that resonated with its audience in ways the show's writers may or may not have intended as commentary. Donna Stone and Margaret Anderson, the wives of the more straightforwardly domestic programs, were different in kind. Competent, warm, impeccably groomed, and almost entirely without interior complexity. They wanted what they had. They were satisfied by what they did. Every episode resolved cleanly, the family intact and harmonious, the domestic order maintained. Watching them from an actual sofa at the end of an actual day was an experience with multiple layers. The pleasure of narrative, the slight vertigo of comparison, and occasionally the particular feeling of watching a performance of your life that was both familiar and completely alien. The advertising that surrounded the programming was doing the same work as the women's magazines, but louder and in motion. Products for the kitchen and the laundry and the children moved across the screen in the voices of women who were delighted by them, and the implicit argument that the correct products made the domestic life not just manageable, but genuinely fulfilling, was delivered with the specific force of something that could look you in the eye. Your children watched it in the afternoon, which was one of the genuinely unmixed blessings of the medium, an hour of supervised entertainment that required nothing of you except that the set was on. You used the time to get something done in the kitchen. You could hear it from there. In the evening, you watched it together, the family assembled in the living room, the screen casting its grey light across everyone's faces, the day winding down. It was often quite nice. That was also true. Across the 1950s, in suburbs and small towns and cities across America, individual women were doing arithmetic. Quietly, privately, sometimes not even admitting it to themselves yet. They were calculating. What would it take? What would I need? What would happen if, not today, not yet, but eventually, things were different? Some were saving a little money. Some were taking a class. Some were writing. Some were simply paying attention in a way they hadn't before, watching and listening and filing things away. The revolution that broke publicly in the early 1960s did not appear from nowhere. It had been building in kitchens for a decade, in the minds of women who had been told to be content and had decided, privately and with great care, that content was not going to be enough. The money was first. Not dramatically, not a secret account built toward escape, not in most cases, though that happened too, but a slow, deliberate accumulation of small amounts in places that were technically shared but practically unmonitored. The household budget passed through your hands, which meant a few dollars a week could move without announcement. You did not think of this as planning an exit. You thought of it as having something of your own, which is a distinction that made sense at the time and makes a different kind of sense in retrospect. The class came next for some. Evening classes at the local college or community school, a typing course, a literature survey, something in accounting. These were easy to explain: self-improvement, a possible supplementary income if things got tight, a social engagement that fit the era's acceptable categories. What they also were was a reactivation of a capacity that had been sitting unused, a return to being assessed on the merit of your thinking rather than the merit of your household management. You went to class and wrote an essay and received a grade and felt something that you hadn't felt in years and had to sit quietly with afterward because it was larger than the occasion seemed to warrant. Some women were writing, not for publication, not yet, and for many not ever, but in the private way that people who need to understand their experience write. Journals kept in the back of the linen closet. Letters to friends in other cities that went further than letters were supposed to go, that said things you hadn't said out loud to anyone in the same room. The writing was a form of thinking, and the thinking was the early work of someone, organising information that hadn't yet found its application. The children were the primary variable in every calculation, and no honest accounting of the women planning quietly in this era can omit them. The exit, if it happened, couldn't leave the children behind, and couldn't, practically, take them without economic resources that most women in this position didn't yet have. The arithmetic had to account for school, for stability, for not detonating the structure that the children were living inside even if the structure wasn't working for you. This made the planning slower, more careful, more layered. It also made the women doing it more patient than their circumstances perhaps deserved. What was being built over the course of this quiet decade was not a revolution, not yet, not individually. It was readiness, an accumulation of small acts of self-preservation and self-knowledge that would, in the aggregate and in the fullness of time, constitute the substrate of something much larger. Betty Friedan was out there interviewing women for her book. The women being interviewed mostly didn't know what they were contributing to. They just knew it felt important to be asked. In an era that organised women's lives around their relationships to men, as wives, as mothers, as daughters-in-law, the friendships between women were quietly doing some of the most important work. They were emotional infrastructure. They were the place where the performance got put down for an hour, where someone understood without explanation, where a bad week could be named out loud without it going anywhere dangerous. Women in the 1950s were not supposed to need this kind of thing, officially. Unofficially, they built entire support systems out of coffee cups and afternoon visits, and the particular shorthand of people sharing the exact same life. The friendship between two women who'd been neighbours for 3 years operated on a frequency that required very little explanation. You knew each other's schedules, each other's children's names and personalities, each other's husbands' particular varieties of difficult, each other's specific pressure points, and what they connected to. When you said I had a hard week, you did not need to specify further, because the contours of a hard week in a life structured like yours were mutually understood at a level of detail that a husband arriving home at 6, leaving at 7:30, spending weekends in a different relationship to the household's operational reality, simply didn't have access to. This shared knowledge was the foundation of the friendship, and also its most practical feature. The friend who knew you well enough to bring dinner on Tuesday without being asked, who could tell from 40 feet away that something was wrong, and who approached with the correct register, not alarmed, not intrusive, just present and available, was performing a function that was genuinely sustaining, and that the era's ideology of wifely self-sufficiency actively obscured. You weren't supposed to need this kind of support. You needed it absolutely. What the friendships provided beyond the practical was witness. There is something specifically important about being seen by someone who is not invested in the performance, who knows you are not, in fact, always fine, who has sat in your kitchen when the composure wasn't holding and has not made this into something alarming or reportable, but has simply stayed. The performance was load-bearing and continuous, and the friendships were the place where the weight got set down for enough time to make it possible to pick it back up. The depth of these friendships was not always acknowledged in the era's social vocabulary. Friendship between women was categorized as pleasant and supplementary, a social comfort, a domestic nicety, not quite in the serious register of a husband's bond with his workplace colleagues or his fraternal associations. This categorization was wrong in ways that women living inside these friendships understood clearly, even when they didn't have the framework to argue it directly. Some friendships crossed into territory the era's vocabulary couldn't comfortably accommodate, an intensity of feeling, a centrality in each other's emotional lives that exceeded what was officially designated as friendship, without necessarily being nameable as anything else. These relationships existed in the space between the available categories, sustained by the practical intimacy of lives lived in close proximity and by a genuine connection that didn't fit neatly into the social architecture surrounding it. You walked across the street on a Thursday afternoon because you needed to, and because she would know that, and because the door would open before you knocked. That was worth more than the era ever said it was. The lawn was not just grass. In 1950s suburban America, the condition of your lawn was a form of self-expression, regulated by community consensus, and occasionally, if things got tense enough, the homeowners association. Men were supposed to mow it. Women were supposed to cultivate the flower beds, maintain the borders, and generally ensure that the exterior of the house communicated everything the interior was supposed to suggest: order, effort, prosperity, good values. A dying rose bed was not a dead plant, it was a rumour. The flower beds were yours in the particular way that things become yours when you are responsible for them, regardless of whether you chose them. You had opinions about them, about what grew well in your specific patch of soil, which varieties survived the winter, what the neighbours' roses were doing that yours weren't, that you had arrived at through years of practical engagement with a small piece of earth that had been handed to you as part of a larger package you had not selected item by item. Spring was the beginning of the outdoor performance season, and it began before the ground was fully ready with the catalogues. The seed catalogues arrived in February, which was optimistic on someone's part, and you read them at the kitchen table with the particular hunger of someone who has been inside for 3 months and needs to believe that colour is coming. You ordered seeds and bulbs and the occasional small ambition, a climbing rose, a new variety of dahlia, and waited. Planting happened in April, on your knees in the dirt, which was one of the few activities in the domestic calendar that was straightforwardly physical and focused in a way that quieted the running operational commentary in your head. The garden asked only for attention to what was in front of you. This soil, this plant, this particular problem of drainage or shade. It was unexpectedly a relief. The neighbours assessed the results continuously and without embarrassment, because the suburban yard was public space in the sense that mattered. It was visible from the street. It contributed to the block's collective aesthetic, and its condition was therefore a community matter as well as a personal one. Compliments on the garden were common and genuine and also slightly competitive, in the way that all compliments in a close proximity community, where everyone is performing the same role, simultaneously carry a faint competitive undertone. The husband mowed. This was, in most households, the division of labour. The large mechanical task of mowing was his, and everything that required kneeling and tending and knowing what things were called was yours. This was presented as a reasonable distribution. The actual time spent gardening over the course of a season versus the actual time spent mowing was not generally subjected to arithmetic, which was probably wise. The backyard was different from the front, less public, less performance, more genuinely yours. The vegetable garden, if you had one, produced things that got eaten, which gave it a satisfying directness that the flower beds, for all their beauty, didn't quite match. You grew tomatoes and beans and whatever the children would actually eat raw from the garden, which was primarily tomatoes and beans. The rest went into the kitchen and from there into dinner, a direct line from soil to table that was one of the few processes in your domestic life where you could see the whole chain at once. The yard was work. It was also, on certain evenings in July, when the light was right and the garden was at its peak and the children were playing somewhere nearby and the neighbourhood was at its best version of itself, something close to beautiful. You deadheaded the roses. You noted what needed doing next week. You went inside. Dinner wasn't going to make itself. By 9 o'clock on a weekday evening in a 1950s house, the children were in bed, the dishes were done, the husband had usually nodded off in front of the television, and the house was quiet in the particular way a house gets quiet when one person in it is still fully awake and thinking. These were the hours that belonged to the housewife most completely, and what she did with them said something about who she was, who she might have been, who she was still quietly trying to figure out how to become. Some read, some wrote, some sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea and thought at length about things they were not ready to say out loud. The television murmured from the living room where the husband had fallen asleep in his chair, which happened with the reliable punctuality of something that didn't need to be scheduled. You covered him with a blanket or you left him, depending on the evening, depending on the week, and you went to the kitchen or the bedroom or wherever the house had a quiet corner that was temporarily yours. The tea went on, or the decaf, which existed now and which was one of the era's minor practical gifts to the wide-awake evening mind. You sat down without immediately standing back up, which was unusual enough in the day's sequence to feel notable. Nobody needed anything from you at this specific moment. The sensation was not unlike setting down something heavy that you'd been carrying long enough that you'd stopped noticing the weight. You only noticed it now in its temporary absence. Some women read. The book that had been sitting on the nightstand for 3 weeks, because every time you'd picked it up someone had needed something. That book, now, finally, in silence. You read several pages before realising you'd actually absorbed them, which was different from the fragment reading of the daytime, the kind where you got through 2 paragraphs and then lost the thread because something had intervened. This was reading. You remembered how it felt to simply follow a sentence to where it was going. Some wrote, "The journal, or the letter, that was longer than it needed to be, and said things the daylight version of yourself was more careful about. Writing at 9:30 at night had a different quality from writing in any other context. The tiredness made the editing function less reliable, which meant the honesty came through more directly, which was either a problem or the point depending on what the writing was for." Some simply sat. The sitting was not nothing. It was not technically rest in the way that sleep was rest, but it was a form of decompression that the day's forward momentum had made unavailable until now. You thought about things. You reviewed the week. You held the question of your life at a slight distance and looked at it, not with panic, not with resignation, but with the sustained thoughtful attention that the life itself rarely permitted during the hours it was actively being lived. The clock moved toward 10:30, toward 11. The husband woke in the living room and came to bed with the foggy courtesy of someone who had not been present for the last 2 hours but was now accounted for. The house settled into its nighttime configuration. You put the book down, or closed the notebook, or rinsed the cup. You lay in the dark and thought for another 20 minutes before sleep came. Those 20 minutes were yours too. You used them. In 1950, the divorce rate in America was considerably lower than it would be 20 years later. Not because marriages were happier, but because divorce carried consequences severe enough to function as a structural deterrent. A divorced woman in the 1950s lost social standing, economic security, and in many cases the respect of her own community, regardless of why the marriage had ended. Women who left anyway, who calculated the costs and decided that the alternative was worse, were making a bet against considerable odds, with full knowledge of what they were risking and what they couldn't afford to keep losing. The social architecture surrounding divorce in the 1950s was designed, whether intentionally or by cultural accumulation, to make it as unappealing as possible. A divorced woman was a category, the divorcee, that carried connotations the era had no particular interest in interrogating fairly. She was either pitied or suspected, and frequently both simultaneously, which was a social position requiring considerable fortitude to occupy without being hollowed out by it. Her children were the subject of a quiet community concern that was expressed as sympathy and sometimes functioned as surveillance. The economics were the hardest part, and they were genuinely hard. A woman leaving a marriage in 1953 was leaving, in most cases, the only income the household had. If she had worked before marriage, she had likely not worked in years. If her skills were current, she could find employment, teaching, nursing, secretarial work, at wages that reflected the era's systematic undervaluation of women's labour. If she had children, she needed childcare while she worked, which cost money she didn't yet have, a circular problem elegant in its cruelty. Alimony existed in theory. In practice, it was inconsistently awarded and inconsistently paid, and pursuing it through the legal system required a lawyer, which required money, which was the thing you were trying to obtain. The legal structure around divorce in the 1950s was not designed around the interests of the party, leaving a marriage without financial resources. It was designed around property and custody, and the mechanics of dissolving a legal agreement and navigating it alone was its own ordeal stacked on top of every other ordeal. And yet women left. Not in the numbers they would leave a decade later, but steadily, with the particular determination of people who have done the full accounting and arrived at a number they can live with. They left marriages where they were being harmed, and they left marriages where they were simply disappearing, and both were real reasons that the era's divorce discourse, which tended to focus on fault, on scandal, on the social disruption of a broken family, was not designed to take seriously. The women who left and rebuilt, who found work, who raised children in reduced circumstances with greater personal freedom, who lived in the smaller apartments and tighter budgets of post-divorce life, and found them, on balance, spacious in the ways that mattered, were making an argument with their lives that the culture wasn't ready to hear. It heard them anyway, eventually. It couldn't not. You knew 2 women on your block who were quietly doing the arithmetic. You didn't say anything, neither did they, but you knew, and knowing, you thought about things you hadn't thought about before. By 1958, 1959, something was shifting. Not loudly yet, not in the streets, not in the headlines, but in the coffee clatches and the book clubs and the quiet hours after 9 o'clock, there was a restlessness that had been building for years and was beginning to press against the perfectly maintained surface of suburban domestic life. Betty Friedan was interviewing women for the book that would become The Feminine Mystique. The pill was in clinical trials. Rock and roll was scandalizing parents who had themselves been quietly scandalous a decade earlier. The children of the baby boom were growing up, and the women who had built the era managed it, cleaned it, cooked for it, and smiled through it. Many of them were done being quiet about what it had cost. The restlessness had a specific texture in these final years of the decade. It was not despair. The women who felt it were not mostly defeated. It was more like the feeling that precedes a decision you haven't made yet. But that is becoming increasingly difficult to defer. The decade had given them a great deal to manage and a great deal to be, and they had managed and been it. And now there was a question gathering force somewhere behind all the efficiency and composure. Is this the whole thing? Is this all of it? And the question was getting harder to put back down. The teenagers were the visible edge of it. The children who had been born in the late 1940s, raised in the post-war suburban dream by women who were managing complex interior lives behind the ironed curtains. Those children were now 15, 16, 17, and they were listening to music that made their parents nervous and wearing things that made their mothers privately think about their own 20-year-old selves and what that had felt like. The counterculture that would break open in the 1960s was being assembled in the bedrooms of houses where the mothers downstairs were reading de Beauvoir and saving money in envelopes. Betty Friedan's interviews were happening. She had gone back to her Smith College classmates 15 years after graduation and asked them a simple question. Are you happy? The answers she received were not what the magazines had been printing. They were careful, qualified, sometimes distressed, frequently articulate descriptions of a gap between the life the era had promised and the life the era had produced. A gap felt most keenly by women who were intelligent and educated, and had been told that intelligence and education were fully satisfied by running a household. They weren't. And the women knew it. They'd been knowing it for years. The pill was coming. This was not yet public knowledge in the way it would become, but it was in the atmosphere, the clinical trials, the research, the impending availability of a technology that would change the relationship between female bodies and female futures in ways that were genuinely revolutionary. The women who would use it first were, in 1958, loading the dishwasher and driving the children to school and attending the PTA, and doing all the things, and the technology that was going to change their options was being tested in laboratories while they did. Something was ending. It didn't look like an ending from inside it. It looked like an ordinary Tuesday in October, the house clean and the dinner planned, and the neighbourhood going about its business on the other side of the kitchen window. But the pressure that had been building in kitchens and book clubs and quiet late evenings for the better part of a decade was approaching the point where it needed to go somewhere. The window opened. The air came in. The 1960s were 3 pages away. And the women who had been quietly thinking, quietly saving, quietly reading and arguing and planning and enduring, they were ready. They had been ready for a while. Not everything that happened in the coffee clatch was honest. This is worth saying plainly because the picture of women's friendship in the 1950s as a space of unfiltered truth has its own romanticism that doesn't entirely hold up. The honesty was real, and it was also partial, calibrated like everything else in the era to what was safe to reveal and what needed to stay inside the performance even when the performance was nominally off. Women kept secrets from their closest friends with the same practiced efficiency they kept them from their husbands, and the secrets they kept from each other were often the most carefully guarded of all, because these were the women who would understand exactly what the secret meant. You didn't tell Barbara about the money you were saving. Not because you didn't trust her, you did, as much as you trusted anyone, but because saying it out loud to a neighbour would make it real in a way that had consequences you weren't ready to manage. As long as it was interior, it was a thought. Said aloud in Barbara's kitchen over coffee, it became a plan, and a plan had implications for your marriage and your block, and the entire social structure of the street that you were not yet prepared to detonate. The unhappiness was the most universally kept secret, which sounds paradoxical in an era when everyone was managing the same version of it. But the specific texture of your unhappiness, the particular shape of the gap between your life and what you'd imagined, the specific things that were missing, the exact nature of what you wanted instead, this was private in a way that the general acknowledgement of difficulty was not. You could say, "I'm tired in the coffee clutch," and be perfectly understood. You could not always say what you were actually tired of, because naming it precisely risked a conversation that ended with someone suggesting you were being ungrateful, or that you should try harder, or that everyone felt this way, which was both true and completely unhelpful. The marriages were the deepest archive of kept secrets. What happened inside a marriage stayed inside it not merely by social convention, but by structural necessity. The marriage was the economic unit, the social unit, the housing unit, the primary relationship organizing your entire life and destabilizing it by speaking honestly about it to someone outside. It was a risk with no clear upside and very clear downsides. So the specific difficulties, the loneliness within the marriage, the ways the person you had married had turned out to be different from what you had understood him to be, the gradual accumulation of small disappointments that nobody had warned you, constituted the texture of a long domestic life. These stayed inside. What women gave each other instead was the code, the tone that communicated more than the words, the pause before answering a question that said everything without saying anything, the look exchanged across a room at a party that translated instantly and accurately as "yes, I know, me too." The friendships of the era operated in this register with a fluency that required years to develop and that functioned as its own language, precise, efficient, and entirely deniable if necessary. It was not dishonesty exactly. It was the management of information in conditions where full transparency was a luxury that the social structure didn't support. The women who kept these secrets were not performing for each other so much as they were protecting each other and themselves from the full weight of what full transparency would require everyone to do about it. You knew more about your three closest neighbours than you had ever said you knew. They knew the same about you. The friendship held all of it without naming it directly, which was, in its way, a form of extraordinary care. She was watching. The daughter, yours, if you had one, or the girl next door, or the one in your daughter's class whose mother you knew from the PTA, was in the kitchen while you cooked, or in the living room while you managed the evening, or at the breakfast table while you moved between the stove and the counter, with the choreographic efficiency of someone who has done this particular sequence so many times, it no longer requires conscious direction. She was watching all of it, and she was filing it away in the part of the child's mind that builds its understanding of what adulthood looks like and what it costs, long before the child has the vocabulary to describe what she's recording. This is the generation that became the 1960s. The girls who grew up in the post-war suburban houses, raised by women who are managing complex interior lives behind composed exteriors, who watch their mothers perform competence and cheerfulness and self-effacement with extraordinary skill, These girls absorbed the performance and also, in many cases, the thing behind it. They saw both layers. Children always see both layers, even when the adults performing them believe they've been convincing. What the daughters of the 1950s were watching was a masterclass in a very specific kind of strength. The strength of sustained endurance, of managing everything while appearing to manage it effortlessly, of keeping the machine running without ever letting anyone see the engine. This was real strength, and the daughters recognized it as such, and many of them carried it forward into their own lives in ways that were useful. The organizational capacity, the social fluency, the ability to hold multiple things in mind simultaneously without dropping any of them. But they were also watching the cost, the tiredness that lived behind the composure, the way a conversation sometimes stopped a few words before it got to what was actually being said, the aspirations that surfaced occasionally, a comment about a book, a reference to something studied in college, a moment of visible intelligence applied to something larger than the household, and then were reabsorbed into the domestic register without being fully expressed. The daughters saw this too, and they felt it, with the specific feeling of watching someone you love operating at partial capacity, using half of what they have. Some daughters grew up determined to replicate the life, the house, the husband, the well-run household, the community standing. This was a legitimate choice, and the women who made it consciously, with full knowledge of its demands, were not making a lesser one. Some grew up determined to do something entirely different, propelled by the image of their mother at the kitchen window on a Tuesday afternoon, with an expression that the daughter had never been able to fully interpret, but had never forgotten. Most grew up with both things living in them simultaneously, the deep respect for what their mothers had done and the equally deep resistance to its constraints, a combination that produced, in the generation that came of age in the 1960s, a particular intensity of purpose. They were not rejecting their mothers. They were completing something their mothers had started in the quiet hours, in the books on the less visible shelf, in the money saved in the envelope at the back of the drawer. The daughters carried the restlessness forward. They made it loud. Their mothers had kept it interior for a decade and maintained everything and waited. That patience was also something the daughters learned. They used it differently. So tonight, as you lie in your clean bed, in your warm house, with your thermostat set to exactly the temperature you chose and your refrigerator full of things you selected without consulting anyone's preferences but your own, take a moment for the women of the 1950s. They woke before everyone else and went to bed last. They cooked 3 meals a day from ingredients that didn't come with instructions, in kitchens that were both their domain and their confinement. They raised the children and ran the household and managed the neighborhood and organized the church and ran the PTA and kept the secrets and maintained the performance, and found, somehow, in the quiet hours after 9 o'clock, small ways to remain themselves inside a decade that was not always interested in who that was. They were not helpless. That is the thing history sometimes forgets in its rush to rescue them. They were extraordinarily capable, some of the most organizationally sophisticated, socially intelligent, emotionally durable people any era has produced, operating inside a structure that used those capacities fully while crediting them barely at all. They managed complexity that would exhaust a modern logistics team, and they did it in heels with lipstick on before anyone else was awake. And quietly, steadily, in the coffee clatches and the book clubs and the late evenings and the long Tuesday afternoons, they were thinking. They were reading things they weren't supposed to be reading. They were saving money in envelopes. They were asking questions that the era didn't have polite answers for, and sitting with those questions patiently, the way people sit with things they know are important and haven't yet figured out what to do with. They built the foundation of everything that came next, not by marching, not yet, but by enduring and observing and refusing, in the interior space where no one could tell them what to think, to believe that the life they'd been handed was the full extent of what they were. Their daughters took to the streets, their granddaughters run companies and hold office, and make decisions about their own bodies and their own time and their own futures in ways that would have looked, from a kitchen window in 1953, like something from a science fiction novel. All of it built on a foundation that was laid in houses that smelled of casseroles and percolated coffee, and the particular quiet of a late evening when everyone else was asleep and one woman was still awake, still thinking, still holding the question open. Be grateful for your complicated life, for the problems that are yours to choose rather than yours to absorb, for the mess and the noise and the options and the mornings when no one has decided for you who you have to be today. And if you have a moment before sleep takes you, which it is coming for now, gently and from all directions, whisper something for the women in the housecoats, the ones who got up first, the ones who figured it out in the dark. They did more than survive the 1950s. They quietly, stubbornly, without anyone officially noticing, carried the whole decade forward on their backs. And then they handed it to us. Good night.